Started, and this section will should probably be a little shorter. We might even get out of here a little early tonight. So, all right, so we're continuing in the Pentateuch is the study that we're doing, but specifically we're starting in Genesis now. So we're going to work in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Just kind of look at them all individually. And so last week we looked at Genesis 1 through 11. All right, so Genesis. Oh, brown. All right, so Genesis 1 through 11. What were two of the main themes of Genesis 1 through 11? Does anybody remember? Actually, most people weren't even here last week. So, okay, yeah, right. We got creation. All right. So God makes a good world for humanity. Okay? And then what was the second major theme? Yeah, okay, right. So he made this, he creates this good world for humanity, but then human sin and the ruin of God's, and the ruin of God's world. Okay, so we see God created the world. He made it good. You know, we looked at the different creation accounts and talked about how God created everything and said that it was good. And then we talked about how, though with humanity, it was different. When God created man, he created them to be special. He created them to be, man was really the climax of that creation. And he didn't just create man according to the pattern that he had followed with everything else. Everything else, he spoke it into existence. What did he do with man? Well, first he created Adam from what? The dust of the earth, right? He breathed life into Adam. And then he created Eve, his wife, from Adam's rib. So here we see, so humanity was created for God, and so God creates this good world for humanity, but then human sin enters, and it mars this world. We talked about, remember the Imago Dei. The Imago Dei means what? Image of God, right? So we were created in God's image, but the fall and sin destroyed that or marred that image. It didn't do away with it. It didn't completely destroy it, but it does damage it and it does mar it. So chapters 12 through 50, which is the end of Genesis, we see that, well, first of all, like in 1 through 11, and Jim pointed this out last week, and we kind of got into a little bit with at the end, it talks about the generations, and there's a lineage there at the end. But really, I mean, all throughout the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we see it starts with Adam and Eve, and then it says, like, these are the generations, and these are the generations, and it keeps pointing down to one man. Now, who's that one man that it keeps pointing down to? Well, eventually, we're going to get there, right? But who first? In Genesis. This is a major character in Genesis. The very first one, what? Abraham. Yeah, right. So we got the story then. So, so chapters 12 through 50 really focus on Abraham and his family. So we see in chapters 12 through 25, we see Abraham. In chapters 26 and 27, Isaac. And then 28 through 36, 28 through 36, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And then from 37 to 50, see the story of Joseph. All right, so So 1 through 11, remember we talked about how it starts out and just really general, talks about the creation of the world and about God's acts. And then so we get down in 12 through 50 and it starts getting really personal, and he starts laying the groundwork for his rescue plan to bring people back to God's original design. And so we start with creation in the Garden of Eden, and then what did we end with? What's the very last story in Genesis chapter 11? What is it? Remember what it was? The Tower of Babel, right? So we've got creation, Garden of Eden, down to the Tower of Babel, and then we see God's creation down to the Tower of Babel and the scattering of the people. And then we jump over to 12 through 50, and it starts talking about God's family, God and Abraham's family. So I want to look at some themes in these books, or these chapters, rather. All right, so the first theme is that God initiates his plan to rescue humanity through his covenant with the family of Abram. All right, so God initiates his plan to rescue humanity through his covenant with Abram, who would later be named Abraham. All right, somebody turn to Genesis chapter 12 and look at verses 1 through 3. Somebody just, when you got it, just say, hey, I've got it. Okay, would you read that for us? Genesis 12, 1 through 3.
The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you."
Okay. Thank you. So what do we see here? So God initiates his plan to rescue humanity through his covenant with the family of Abram. Now, what did that covenant entail? There were 4 things that this covenant entails. What's the first one? They're going to grow into a nation. All right. So we've got, and then number 2, we've got they will inherit the land of Canaan. Number 3, they will receive a great name. Number 4, all the nations will find God's blessing through this family. All right, so they will grow into a nation. They will inherit the land of Canaan. I always forget where the second A is. How do you? Huh?
That'll help you remember it. Instead of Canaan.
Okay.
Canaan.
Okay.
That's the Hebrew.
Oh well.
Yeah.
So Canaan, they will receive a great name. And then finally, we see all the nations will find God's blessing through this family. They will be a blessing to the nations. Okay, so this is God's promise to Abraham, but also I want to take a kind of just a sidetrack here, all right? Because to start talking about covenants, because covenant really lays the foundation for the rest of the Scripture and the fulfillment of God's rescue plan. So this is God's covenant with Abraham. There were 4 major covenants that we see in Scripture. All right, 4 major covenants. Does anybody know what I'll give you a hint. Abraham is the second one. Does anybody know what the first one was? Huh? Well, Noah, okay. And then we have Abraham. And then we have, anybody know what's next? Jim, I know you know what's next. Okay, yeah. So Israel, as you'll hear it called different things. Mosaic, the covenant with Moses, covenant with Israel, but it was made at the giving of the law. So we'll say Moses. Okay. Anybody know what the last one is? Well, okay, I think I know where you're going, though. But I'm thinking of another one, an Old Testament one first. Yeah. Close. David. All right, so, let me find. Okay, so first of all, let's take a step back. What is a covenant?
Contract.
Okay, a contract. Good. Between who? You got a contract, and it's between two. Well, just a covenant in general. In general, yeah, it's between two parties. Okay, and each party does what? They make promise, right? And so with a covenant, there are two parties. They make a promise. And what do they, and there's also not only a promise, but there's also a consequence for not keeping that covenant. Okay, so did God need us in any of this? Did God need to make covenants with his people? Well, not really. I mean, he could have done everything himself. But he, in his sovereignty, he desires to share his sovereignty, not necessarily that we're sovereign, but he shares that with us in partnership, and so that we work together with God. And so he makes covenants with us. He doesn't have to do that, but he creates these covenants where he actually is promising to fulfill certain things to us. And there would be consequences for him breaking it. Now, we know that God doesn't break his promises, right? We know that he keeps his covenants. But he makes that covenant with us and says that if we will follow his commands, if we follow the covenant, then there will be blessings for us. But if we do not obey the covenant, then what happens? There are consequences, right? Now, we know that we are not good at keeping our covenants with God, right? We know from the nation of Israel, I mean, we see all throughout the nation's history, we see broken promise after broken promise. And so let's look at some of these covenants. First, look at, somebody turn to Genesis chapter 9, verses 8 through 17. All right, let me divvy these out, and then we'll go back to them. All right, so we've already read Genesis 17. Actually, no, let's read Genesis 17, 1 through 22, because that goes into more detail about the covenant with Abraham. Somebody turn to Genesis 17, 1 through 22. Who's got Genesis 9, 8 through 17? Okay, Bonnie said she's got it. Genesis 17, 1 through 22. Jim, you want to take that? And then Exodus 34. Okay, got Michelle. And then 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 17. 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 17. Okay, got Jesse? Okay. Bonnie, will you read? Okay, so Bonnie's going to read about the covenant, God's covenant with Noah. Bonnie? Okay? So this is the covenant with Noah. Now, what does God promise to do? Never flood the earth again, right? What was Noah to do? What was the promise or what was the condition for him? It's a trick question, kind of nothing. This is actually one of the covenants that God makes with Noah, with no strings attached for Noah. And I think it just shows God's character and the way He works with it, to know that we could never keep these covenants. But him and His graciousness, He promises never to flood the earth again. You what? Unconditionally, right. And then not only that, but He puts His promise, and He makes it plain by giving us a symbol, a sign of His covenant, which is, the rainbow. So every time we look out and see a rainbow across the sky, it looks really pretty, and we all think, oh, look at the rainbow and everything. But we can remember that is God's promise to never flood the earth again. All right? Who had Genesis 17, 1 through 22? Jim? All right, so this is God's covenant with Abraham.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai, God Almighty. Serve me faithfully and live a blameless life. I will make a covenant with you by which I will guarantee to give you countless descendants. At this, Abraham fell down on his face, fell on the ground. Then God said to him, this is my covenant with you. I will make you the father of a multitude of nations. What's more, I'm changing your name. It will no longer be Abram. Instead, you will be called Abraham, for you will be the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful. Your descendants will become many nations, and kings will be among them. I will confirm my covenant with you and your descendants after you from generation to generation. This is an everlasting covenant. I will always be your God and the God of your descendants after you. And I will give you the entire land of Canaan, where you now live as a foreigner, to you and your descendants. It will be their possession forever, and I will be their God. Then God said to Abraham, your responsibility is to obey the terms of the covenant. You and all your descendants have this continual responsibility. This is the covenant that you and your descendants must keep. Each male among you must be circumcised. You must cut off the flesh of your foreskin as a sign of the covenant between me and you. From generation to generation, every male child must be circumcised on the 8th day after his birth. This applies not only to members of your family, but also to servants born in your household and the foreign-born servants whom you have purchased. All must be circumcised. Your bodies will bear the mark of my everlasting covenant. Any male who fails to be circumcised will be cut off from the covenant family for breaking the covenant. Then God said to Abraham regarding Sarai, your wife, her name will no longer be Sarai. From now on, her name will be Sarah. And I will bless her and give you a son from her. Yes, I will bless her richly, and she will become the mother of many nations. Kings of nations will be among her descendants. Then Abraham bowed down to the ground, but he laughed to himself in disbelief. How could I become a father at the age of 100, he thought? And how could Sarah have a baby when she's 90 years old? So Abraham said to God, may Ishmael live under your special blessing. But God replied, no, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to a son for you. You will name him Isaac, and I will confirm my covenant with him and his descendants as an everlasting covenant. As for Ishmael, I will bless him also, just as you have asked. I will make him extremely fruitful and multiply his descendants. He will become the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will be confirmed with Isaac, who will be born to you, and Sarah about this time next year. When God had finished speaking, he left Abraham.
Okay? So in God's covenant with Abraham, what did He promise to do? Yeah, make him a great nation, bless the nations through him, right? Land, yeah, all these things that we talked about, right? So grow into a nation, inherit the land of Canaan. Because remember, this is just a repeat of what God, when God originally called Abram, this is God clarifying that covenant with him. So we see all these things, all right? So what were the conditions? Okay, yeah, circumcision was to be a sign of the covenant, right? And what else? Hmm? So circumcision was the sign of the covenant, and then but what do we see? What is the condition for the covenant? What were the people in order for or God said, I will make you a nation, a great nation. I will multiply you. I will bless the nations through you if you do what? Obey, right? If you obey, then I will do all these things. Now, again, did the people obey? No. I mean, they very quickly departed from this covenant, right? So let's go on to the Mosaic covenant. Exodus chapter 34. Who had that? Michelle? And we don't have to read the whole chapter. I just put the whole chapter on there. Wasn't really thinking about the reading out loud. So let's start in verse 10, and let's go through verse 16.
And he said, Behold, I make a covenant. Before all your people I will do marvels such as have not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation. And all the people among whom you are shall see the work of the Lord. For it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe what I command you this day. Behold, I am driving out from before you the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Hivite and the Jebusite. Take heed to yourself, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land where you are going, lest it be a snare in your midst. But you shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images. For you shall worship no other God, for the Lord, whose name is a jealous God. Lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they play the harlot with their gods, and make sacrifice to their gods, and one of them invites you, and you eat of his sacrifice. And you take of his daughters for your sons, and his daughters play the harlot with their gods, and make your sons play the harlot with their gods.
Okay, so what's happening here? What's God doing with Moses here, first of all? He's taking the covenant and renewing it, right? So the people have failed miserably by this point. And so he gives them the law, he establishes or renews the covenant. And so what does he promise to do? The what? Yeah, wonders. I mean, and really he's making a promise to them to be their God, right? He's making a personal promise to them at this point. And because that's why he goes into so much detail about driving out all the people from the land. And then also, too, he says you ought to tear down their altars, break down their pillars, and cut down the Asherah poles. For you will worship no other God, for I am a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. So, instead of making a covenant with, and don't go off and start making covenants with the people of the land, in other words. And become and prostitute yourselves with the other gods and sacrifice to their gods. So he's making a personal promise to be their God, okay? And so again, what's the word? Condition. Thank you. Sometimes I tell you, the words just like. Yeah, obey. Again, right, okay. Okay, now let's go on to the last one, the Davidic covenant. Who had 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 17? 7, 12 through 17. Okay, thank you. So what is God promising here?
Kingdom, seed,
Yeah. Right. So now God is starting to make this these promises to start setting up the coming of the Messiah, because he says, like, it's through the throne. He's establishing David's kingship. He's establishing the throne because through him will come the Messiah. Now, what are the conditions? Hmm?
Well, it doesn't say
Yeah,
specifically.
right.
It's unconditional, but there are some, he says, if he commits iniquity, I'm going to chasten him.
Right.
That implies the obeying.
So there's an implication that, again, there's an obeying. Now, but God's going to fulfill his purposes, right, regardless of their obedience or disobedience. Okay, so I mean, this one we don't, I mean, we didn't, there was no condition, right? But Abraham, did the people keep the covenant that he made with Abraham? No. Right? Did the people keep the covenant that he made with Moses? No. I mean, we can cross this off, even though there weren't really any conditions. I mean, we still, you'll get the picture here in a second. Now, the people still were disobedient, even, in and through and after the Davidic covenant. So we've got all these covenants that were broken, not by God, but by people, right? And so the prophets start talking, though, about another covenant. And this covenant, well, what do you think it is? Okay, who ushered in a covenant called what we call the what? The new covenant, right? So he talks that they start talking about this new covenant, because where we could not obey here, Jesus becomes the great Abraham, the perfect Abraham. I mean, he becomes the perfect Noah. That's a really weird and there we go. Jesus becomes the perfect Moses, and Jesus, through David's line and through his lineage, becomes the perfect David. So we see that Jesus now then is the one who fulfills all of these covenants when we could not. And so that's important for us to understand, because, well, let me ask you, why is that important for us to understand? Yeah, we could not fulfill the covenants, right? They could only be fulfilled by Jesus, because he was perfect, right? Because he was the promised Messiah, because he is God in the flesh. All right, so let's move on to theme number 2. So we see, first of all, God initiates his plan to rescue humanity through his covenant with Abram and others. Number 2 is God's blessing to the nations through Abraham provides the foundational storyline for the rest of the Bible. All right, so God... Okay. God's blessing to the nations through Abraham provides the foundational storyline for the rest of the Bible. And God promises to be a blessing to the nations. He promises to eventually that the promised rescuer would come through the blessing that he provided in Abraham. So let's move on. Number 3. I'm not going to go too much into these for time's sake. This is where I'm going to
Just
pull it. There we go. Okay, so the rest of the story focuses on Abraham's family, okay? So, but we see here in all this, so Abraham, you would expect, if it focuses on Abraham's family and his children and his children's children, you would expect that it would be really a model of exemplary behavior and life for us, right? But we see that that's actually one of the interesting things about the Scripture is that it does not elevate people to some kind of godlike status where people are heroes and they never mess up. Abraham's family was pretty dysfunctional. There were many times where Abraham's family disobeyed. For example, I'm not going to draw this out. Two times he gave his wife away to another man, claiming that she was not his wife. Right? Right, yeah. She's my sister, right? Now, one time was kind of for protection. The other time was kind of for protection, but it was really kind of self-serving. So he gives his wife away two times. And then Sarah tries to force God's hand. Remember, so God made this covenant with Abram and said, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. He takes him outside and he tells him to look up at the stars, right? And here in South Georgia, we see the stars, right? Like where I grew up in Atlanta, you could go out and maybe see a few stars. Here, you go out on a clear night and you can see just multitudes of stars. God takes Abraham outside and he says, look up at the stars. And he says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and your descendants will be as the stars in the sky. Okay, so Abraham, though, and Sarah, they get a little impatient. They're old by this point, and so Sarah forces God's hand to give them a child by having Abraham sleep with Hagar. All right, so now, in their mind, they were probably thinking, well, maybe this is God's way of providing, right? But then we see out of that, we see who was born out of that? Ishmael. And so Ishmael, that causes all sorts of family dysfunction and I may be mistaken on this because I did not read this to confirm, but is not Ishmael where eventually we get Islam from? Okay, I wanted to make sure because I didn't. That was kind of a side note. But what? Yeah. So we see eventually through Ishmael's line we get the religion of Islam that comes out of that. So, but in both of those things, God remains faithful to his people, and he makes a covenant with them, right? So then we also see, Isaac is born finally. Isaac is the birth of promise. He's the son of promise. And Isaac, what does he do? He gives away his wife Rebekah, right? I mean, you can't make this stuff up, right? Especially when you're claiming that what you're writing is scripture. I mean, this goes to show part of why I believe that the Bible is inspired, because God made it a point to show our disobedience and our wayward hearts. Isaac gives away his wife Rebekah. Jacob was a thief and a liar. What did Jacob do? He stole the blessing, right? Now, because it should have been his brothers. It should have been Esau's, right? Now, so what does Jacob do? He comes in and he deceives his father, who is old and blind. Who does that, right? Who deceives their old, blind father, right? But Jacob does. He steals the blessing and the birthright. And then we see Joseph's brothers. What do they try to do? They try to kill him. Well, they want to kill him at first, and then they say, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't kill him. Maybe we'll just, pretend that he's dead, tell our father that he's dead, and sell him into slavery, right? But but God redeems all this. God is faithful to his people. And, Jacob, or Joseph rather, what does he do? He gets sold into slavery. He's taken to Egypt. and he's put in prison for a pretty long time, but eventually God rises him through the ranks, and he becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh himself. So the point, though, is that Abraham's family is dysfunctional, but it's so dysfunctional that God's divine promises will only be fulfilled through God's faithfulness, not theirs. You see, because if they were the perfect family, if they were the model family, then they could kind of claim, okay, well, look at what we did. But it goes to show that God's promises can only be fulfilled by his faithfulness, and not ours. Okay, so I didn't end up drawing anything for this. Actually, but I'll leave it over here because I'm out of room on the other side anyway. This is the fourth theme. God remains committed to his family and his promises and constantly intervenes to rescue them. God remains committed to his family and promises. Intervenes. And intervenes to rescue them. So God, where Abraham gives his wife Sarah away 2 times, God rescues Sarah twice, and he rescues Rebekah from the disobedience of their husbands. Right? Again, God provides an heir for Abraham and Sarah. Where they messed up and took matters into their own hands, God still provided an heir for Abraham and Sarah. God protected Jacob despite his selfishness and his deception. He deceived his father and he booked it out, right? But God watched over him. God protected him. And then lastly, we see God transforms the evil of Joseph's brothers into something that saves the lives of people from many nations. Somebody look up Genesis 50:20. Genesis 50:20. Just read it when you got it.
But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people alive.
Okay, so at the end of the Joseph story, I love the Joseph story. I mean, it's a great story of God's providence and his sovereignty, but also just kind of balanced with man's disobedience, man's rebellion, but also just the show that God is faithful to his people. What you meant for harm, what you meant for evil, what does it say? God used it for good, right? And so that actually becomes kind of the theme verse for the entire book of Genesis, that what you meant for evil, God means for good. So God transforms the evil of his brothers into something that saves the lives of people from many nations. But it also continues this story, this line of redemption, because it is how eventually the Israelites make it to Egypt. And then what do we see many years later? This is getting into other books, yeah, but we see the Exodus because we see how a Pharaoh, they move to Egypt, they settle, they're doing great. But then a Pharaoh comes up that didn't know about Joseph, and he puts them into slavery, right? And so that sets the stage for the further revealing of God's rescue plan, because he takes them, he hears their cry, right? And then he raises up another prophet. Who's that? Moses. We'll get into all this later. But he raises up Moses, and he sends Moses back to rescue his people. We see the plagues, we see the Passover instituted, and all of those things point to and foreshadow the coming of the Messiah. So, and then lastly, number 5. we see the pattern of how God works in the world begins in Genesis and continues through the Bible. And this is the pattern. He works through people of low status who are weak or marginalized. How can I summarize? Okay. Marginalized. I think that's right. Okay. For example, who was first born? Cain or Abel? Cain. Cain was first born. But who received the blessing? Abel, right? Who was born first? Isaac or Ishmael? Ishmael, right? We already covered that because Ishmael was born when they tried to take matters into their own hands. But who was it that received the promise? Isaac. All right, who was born first? Jacob or Esau? Esau was born first, but we see that Jacob received the blessing, right? Joseph and Reuben, who was born first? Reuben. Who received the blessing or the promise? Joseph, right? And then also we see that God moves towards those. So he not only he works through people who are weak. In those days, the blessing would have been given to the oldest son. But we see that instead God, in his sovereignty, chose to fulfill his promises through other people. But also we see that God moves towards those who are rejected. You know, Hagar and Ishmael in Genesis 21, 8 through 20, they were rejected. They were put out, and so God moves towards them, and God blesses them. Leah, who was the unloved wife, right? We know that he loved Rachel more than Leah, but still God loved Leah and blessed her. And then also we see Joseph. Joseph was the despised brother. You know, all the other brothers hated him because he was loved by his father the most. And he was, this was probably one of his downfalls, was that, his father played favorites. I mean, he made it pretty obvious. He gives him the coat and everything. But God still blessed Joseph and still supernaturally moved in his life to to fulfill his promises, but also to make his plans come to fruition. All right, so what are some of the character traits of God that are displayed in his decision to bless all the nations through Abraham, even after the disaster of Babel? This is just talk. Yeah, he's faithful to his people, okay, but also he's faithful to what? Himself, right? His plan. And so he just, even after Abraham and even after, the people rebel, even after they try to make a name for themselves, he is still faithful. Yeah. He's not just faithful, but he also redeems the people. And like we just talked about with all these other examples of disobedience and sinfulness, he still redeems them. He still blesses them. Good.
Genesis 3:15 never falters from the promise of sending that rescuer.
Yeah.
And so every one of these steps you can see man messes up. I mean, really thwarts the plans of God, but God somehow manages it and works it so that Genesis 3:15 stays true
Right.
until Matthew.
Right, all throughout, right, up to, the coming of the Messiah. And then, and this is why we're going over all this, because now then you see how the Genesis is pointing to the coming of the Messiah, right? And then so when Jesus comes and we read about the life of Jesus and what he did, we see how it was a fulfillment of everything that we're reading about in Genesis. So everything points to him. And so we're looking forward and we're looking back, and we see how the two line up. Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, so before Joseph rose to power, I mean, he spent decades, I think it was, in prison. And he was, not only did he spend that time in prison, but he was also backstabbed, or I guess, I don't know if that's the right word necessarily, but, because was it the baker or it was the baker who made the promise to him when he interpreted the dream that, oh yeah, I'll tell Pharaoh about you, and then he forgets about him, right? And he spends another however long in prison.
His brothers did all that to him. He was a little crafty.
Oh yeah, he was a little
Like, I'm gonna rule over y'all.
yeah, right. Yeah, you read. I mean, of course, he's just telling his dream, right? But you do sense a little in the narrative. You sense a little bit of an arrogance, right? Kind of like I'm the favorite, and I know it, and all of y'all know it, right? Okay, so let's see. So, what are some of the lowest moments in Jacob's story that shows that he didn't deserve to inherit the promised blessing? And what does this teach us about God's grace in dealing with people?
Well, when he put on goat skin,
Yeah.
goes into his blind, decrepit father, and fools him, steals the blessing. I mean, that was, as you said, who does that?
Right.
So, I mean, but God still told them before they were born, the younger.
Yeah. We'll serve the younger, the older, I mean.
Yeah, and so he never wavered from that, even though Jacob tried his best to do things his way.
Right.
God still had his way, and
Yeah.
Jacob had to go through some rough patches
Right.
because of it.
Yeah.
That's what we've been studying about in Sunday school. This very thing you're talking about, God had a plan of redemption, but man messes it up, and yet God's plan is never off point.
Right. It never deviates at any point. In fact, you could almost argue that the disobedience was part of the plan. I mean, to a certain extent.
But it's the way I always say it is despite the disobedience.
Yeah, right.
Not because.
Right, not because of the disobedience, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that, but God still knew that they would be disobedient, and he is able to work through that disobedience anyway, so.
This morning Sunday school lesson started off with a really neat analogy. Yeah. Where it talked about professional athletes. They get a signing bonus.
Mm-hmm.
All right. You can have a career-ending injury at the first play of your professional career, but you still get that signing bonus. That is unconditional. However,
Right.
there are blessings that are based on performance. So if you don't get injured, you go on, you have a Hall of Fame career, you will be blessed through your works and your actions and all that. But those are conditional.
Right.
But God's blessings are shown over and over and over again to be unconditional. However,
Right.
if you obey, you can also.
There are some additional blessings that you might miss out on if you had, if that you might miss out on because of your disobedience, whereas you might have received them if you had been obedient. But yeah, the fact remains that God's promise doesn't change, and God's plans are not thwarted. How arrogant are we to think that we could ever do anything that would change or alter God's plan? I mean, that gives us a whole lot of power that we don't deserve. Because if anything, we're the ones to mess it up. So, all right. Well, we're done. So, unless anybody has any questions, we will be dismissed.
Genesis 3:15, is that what you said?
Yeah, the promise, that he'll crush his heel.
The serpent, yeah.
That's the first promise of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I mean, they call it the first, proto-evangelion. I mean, it's the first first instance, I guess, of the gospel in the Scripture. Even though it's not really explicit, but I mean, you see that. I mean, it's the promise. Yeah, yeah.
It's the kernel
Right,
from which
right. From which everything else, will come. That. Good.
that was good.
All right. Well, we will hopefully see y'all Wednesday.